Of course this does. That was obviously something that probably held the Asahi back from ever doing this, because the last thing they wanted was to give the revisionist right wing its big prize. The issue of coercion for the right is paramount.
You're listening to Asia News Weekly, news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. Hong Kongers still cling to the hope of universal suffrage, Australia ups its anti-terror monitoring, and Japan's revisionists are at work. These stories and more are on the February 27th edition of Asia News Weekly. Hello everyone, welcome to Asia News Weekly. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading this week's edition of the podcast. We're going to turn our attention to Hong Kong for our first story this week, where much of the news this past year has, of course, revolved around the story of those residents trying to pursue universal suffrage. People rising up against what's called the Beijing Plan. The plan where a central committee would pick 2 or 3 candidates, presumably pro-Beijing, and then force Hong Kongers to vote for them. It's not what the residents wanted. They wanted true democracy. They wanted to choose their own candidates, and this, of course, led to months of protests out in the streets. Chief Executive C.Y. Leung urged the residents of Hong Kong, in fact, to behave more like sheep in his Chinese New Year address, something that of course angered Benny. While the protests have faded from the headlines around the globe, for many, the pursuit of full democratic elections is something still worth pursuing. We saw peaceful demonstrations at the beginning of this month, and somewhere between 8,800 and 13,000 people took to the streets once more, of course depending on who you ask. If it's the protesters, 13,000. If it's the police, well, they're erring on the side of caution and saying it's around 8,800. Anyway, they gathered at Victoria Park to protest that Beijing plan. Leading the charge were those key figures from the Occupy Central movement, Benny Tai, Chan Kim-man, and the Reverend Chu Yu-ming. In fact, Democratic Party founding chairman Martin Lee Chu-ming was also there. But in reality, that was the last major push. Coming up in June, or maybe July, there will be a legislative vote essentially to ratify the Beijing Plan. Democratic members have vowed to vote down the measure. Ronnie Tong, a moderate Democratic lawmaker, has even said, quote, "Unless we can resolve this conflict between Beijing and Hong Kong, not only will we not get universal suffrage, but I fear that there will be an unhappy ending to one country, 2 systems." End quote. On the streets, some are even advocating for full independence from China. Truthfully, all this is great, and I truthfully support their calls for true democracy. It's something I really want for them. But, in all honesty, I know the chances of that happening are next to nil. It's something that I have said from the beginning. It's something that even the experts have said as well. From our most recent Asia Now podcast, Mark Kozad with the Rand Corporation.
And as we've seen from the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, it makes it extremely difficult for others to exert pressure when the Chinese are willing to wait it out. They made decisions on how they were going to handle those protests, and they were willing to suffer the consequences for a period of time. And as they got further and further away from that, the consequences started going away. And I think that in many respects, they're probably even in a more favorable situation from their standpoint. Yes, it's something that they don't want to have to deal with. Yes, they understand they're getting increased international criticism, but at the same time, they're more able to withstand that now than they have been in the past.
The truth of the matter is, Beijing is simply too afraid of losing control, of allowing that degree of autonomy in Hong Kong, fearing it could one day spread to the mainland, or they could lose their grasp of control there. No matter how much the protesters want things to change, or for that matter, how much the United Kingdom and other Western governments want things to change, Beijing has the power to wait it out. Yes, the protesters took to the streets. Yes, they've gotten their message out. Yes, the world is on their side. But Beijing waited. 2 months passed. The protesters then became fatigued, and authorities came in and swept them away. In 1989, Beijing cleared out Tiananmen Square with deadly force. Hundreds, perhaps even thousands perished. And while we were horrified at the event a quarter century ago, relations with China have been repaired, and in many ways, they've grown. My point is this. Protesters are calling for an immediate change. They want universal suffrage in 2017 because that's what they feel is due to them. Let me tell you this, it is not going to happen. Pursuing the current course of action borders on being irresponsible. Like China, protesters need to play the long game. Beijing isn't going to shift. It isn't going to move from its current position. Going up against the CCP the way that protesters are going about it now won't affect change. It's like throwing water at a mountain. Nothing's going to happen. But over time, a steady stream of water can carve out a gorge. Protesters need to step back. They need to plan for the future and be that steady stream of water. And then change can happen. Later, Japan's right-wing historical revisionists take a liberal paper to court and risk dividing East Asia even more. Australia's Prime Minister Tony Abbott has said the threat to Australia is worsening. Quote, "The number of foreign fighters is up. The number of known sympathizers and supporters of extremism is up. The number of potential homegrown terrorists is rising. In proclaiming a caliphate, the Islamic death cult Islamic State has declared war on the world." End quote. He went on to say that the biggest threat to Australia are those willing to self-radicalize. And he announced last weekend that the nation is going to monitor social media in real time. They're going to look for terrorist propaganda on the internet, hoping to help authorities identify and dismantle online messages of hate from groups, especially those affiliated with ISIS. Why are they doing this? Well, as I said, they think the greatest threat to Australia are those who are willing to self-radicalize and are homegrown extremists. In recent months, we've seen terror raids against those influenced by ISIS planning to carry out public beheadings. We've seen the Sydney siege, and we've seen the ability of radical groups overseas to reach out through the internet to Australian Muslims trying to pervert their idea of their religion. In fact, it's estimated that about 110 Australians are thought to be fighting currently with the Islamic State. To accomplish all this, the government, of course, will need the assistance of tech companies like ISPs, Google, Facebook. And of course, this also raises a number of privacy concerns. But Electronic Frontiers Australia believes those risks are minimal. John Lawrence said, quote, "I don't think we're necessarily looking here at something that's going to be sort of wading through people's Facebook pages until such a point as they might have been identified as somebody of interest." End quote. If we look at the United States and the Snowden revelations, in all honesty, the government may already be doing this. Yes, social media posts are public to a degree, and culling them for radical keywords, thoughts, extremist views would actually be prudent. But if that means crossing into private communications, then there's a problem. So many of our personal freedoms have been eroded since 2001. First, there was Al-Qaeda. Now it's ISIS. What's going to be the next excuse? Abbott says personal freedoms need to be redrawn as we enter this new dark age. But do they? How do you feel about the government monitoring your social media feeds for radical elements? Is it a responsible, preventative security measure? Or is it a move to subjugate the masses? Coming up shortly, and on a slightly related note, the Bali Nine and the fallout from Indonesia's harsh stance on capital punishment. When discussing Korean and Japanese relations, unfortunately, there are no shortage of problems keeping those two countries from forming very prosperous ties. First, we have the ECC of Japan debate that actually forces international companies to change the way that they display maps on their walls. IKEA in Seoul is one of the latest companies hit by this. Then there's the Dokdo Takashima issue, which constantly has both nations recalling envoys to their offices to berate them for the way that the other nation is behaving. But the biggest issue is, of course, the comfort women. Women sexually enslaved by the Japanese Imperial Army, and not just Koreans, it was women throughout Asia. And some experts put that number as high as 200,000. In Japan, right-wing revisionists claim that they weren't sexual slaves, that they were prostitutes, that they were paid for their work, and they have gone to great lengths to try and push that belief on a global scale. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono acknowledged what Japan had done, and he apologized on behalf of the nation. And since then, revisionists have tried to lessen those words. Even now, there is a call for a full retraction, or at least a rewording of that statement. And the reason these politicians are calling for that is this. It all boils down to statements by Seiji Yoshida. He said he worked with the Japanese military rounding up women on Jeju, and the Asahi Shimbun printed these stories. It brought incredible worldwide attention to the plight of the sexual enslavement of Koreans. But there was a problem. The stories weren't true. Historians debunked these stories a long time ago, but it wasn't until 2014 when the Asahi issued a formal retraction. Quote, "We have judged that Mr. Yoshida's statement, in which he said that he took comfort women by force from Jeju Island, was fake, and we retract the article. At the time, we could not figure out that the statement was fake." End quote. Right-wing Japan, of course, jumped on this, and the Asahi paid a very steep price. When the story broke, I asked Michael Chuchek, adjunct fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan, if the retraction vindicated the revisionists.
Of course this does. That was obviously something that probably held the Asahi back from ever doing this, because the last thing they wanted was to give the revisionist right wing its big prize. Ha, we were right. You see, we were right after all. The issue of coercion for the right is paramount. For some reason, whether it's because they really do believe that it's an insult to the honor of the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy, when so many things that they did were so dishonorable, I don't see why they would be going on this one particular element of the behavior of the imperial forces prior to 1945. But they seem to have gone overboard on the idea that we don't do roundups of women. Well, they did in the prisoner of war camps holding Dutch prisoners of war in Indonesia. That was documented, and for that, the Dutch government in the 1990s and up into the millennial years worked with what was called here in Japan the Asian Women's Fund to identify and find people who had been taken physically from the prisoner of war camps to serve as sexual slaves within this system of institutionalized prostitution.
Unfortunately, the problems for the liberal paper haven't ended. A new lawsuit is being brought against the paper by 2,100 individuals, including Japanese nationals living in the United States. It's being filed in a Tokyo district court, and the plaintiffs are seeking 3 million yen in damages and asking that the paper place ads both in the United States and the European Union, apologizing for the coverage. Why? Well, they say the paper was instrumental in shaping global opinion about Japan's role on the comfort women issue. that the paper tainted Japan's honor. As Chuchek pointed out, in their mind, this one instance of debunking the forceful recruitment of comfort women negates all the evidence of sexual slavery, despite the mountains of evidence to the contrary. Even Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe reportedly takes this view. He's often accused of whitewashing history, and many suspect he will be less conciliatory of Japan's role in World War II during his August 15th address marking the 70th anniversary to the end of the war. Furthermore, some 8,700 people, including conservative lawmakers and professors, filed a similar lawsuit with the district court against the Asahi last month. The ramifications of this case must be watched. Not so much the legal outcome, which is important, but the impact it may have on East Asian relations. Most Japanese don't buy into the revisionist tales. They either don't know about it or are ashamed about Japan's history, and they know that Japan is culpable. In fact, Japan's Crown Prince Naruhito said as much in his recent birthday address, saying that when the memories of the war are fading, we must look back humbly on the past and correctly pass on the tragic experiences and history Japan pursued from the generation which experienced the war to those without direct knowledge. But for South Korea and China, those bringing the suits, while a minority of the population, represent those in power. Going to this great length to force a revision of fact could have wide-reaching implications. First, it could drive a deeper wedge between the Republic of Korea and Japan. Relations are already strained, and this could sour them even more. It took 3 years for an intelligence sharing deal to be reached to combat the threat of North Korea. And even then, it's not an open sharing agreement. The United States has to be the go-between. And let us not forget, President Park Geun-hye and Prime Minister Abe have yet to meet. And honestly, it's not likely that they will. Second, the rift could make President Park seek closer ties to China. After all, China has no love for Japan on historical issues such as these, and should that occur, it would create a strategic problem in the region for the United States, especially at a time when China is expanding. Hopefully, the court does the right thing, recognizes the revisionist nature of the case, and rules on the right side of history. But Korea also needs to come to terms with its past. Many Koreans collaborated with the Imperial Army to build up the comfort women system, and that aspect in Korea is often overlooked. Then there's the entire camp system Korea employed after the Korean War. Neither country is completely innocent, so don't make this a political battle. The time is right to faithfully honor those whose rights were violated, and to finally put this dark and disturbing chapter away. What else is happening in the Asia-Pacific region? Coming up, a wrap-up of the news you may have missed. Around the world, there are several topics that are hotly debated. Who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and of course, one of those topics has been in the news lately, that of capital punishment. It is a very highly contested topic. And the question always boils down to, what do you do with violent criminals? Do you imprison them for life, or do you kill them? And which provides suitable justice for the victims? Indonesia has some of the harshest laws on the books when it concerns drug violations, drug convictions. If you are convicted in Indonesia on a drug-related charge, you could face the death penalty. And usually, they're carried out by firing squad. In January, they executed 6 people from Brazil and the Netherlands, and this prompted international condemnations, but especially from those 2 countries. The execution of nationals from both of those countries set off a diplomatic row, where both nations withdrew their ambassadors, In fact, Brazil then prohibited Indonesia's ambassador to be credentialed in their country, and right now, Indonesia is also reevaluating the purchase of fighter jets and rocket launchers from Brazil. Which brings us to our current situation, the confrontation with Australia. 2 Australians are on the hook for the death penalty, and they could be executed, well, any day now. And despite international pleas for clemency, especially those from Prime Minister Tony Abbott, well, it looks like those executions are going to take place. PM Tony Abbott even tried to guilt Indonesia into their release by linking the 2004 tsunami aid to a reciprocal act of kindness. The legal team behind the so-called leaders of the Bali Nine, who were arrested 10 years ago, have tried a number of legal recourses these past few days, and all of them have been rejected. So, Mayuran Sakumaran and Andrew Chan, they still face that death penalty. Indonesian President Joko Widodo has even said, quote, "Do not intervene in executions. This is Indonesia's judicial and political sovereignty," end quote. The execution had been scheduled for February, but has since been delayed for logistical reasons. Lawyers for the pair plan to appeal the court's latest ruling, quote, "According to the judge, the president's rejection of the clemency petition is not an administrative act, so this court does not have the jurisdiction to accept our case. We plan to appeal today's decision. We have 2 weeks to file an appeal. If the law is respected, the execution should be postponed until the legal process is over," end quote. But exactly how successful this new legal request will be remains to be seen. President Widodo continues to tell other nations to essentially back off. Tobias Basuki, political analyst at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, says, quote, "The executees are still criminals. I think foreign countries, no matter how assertive they are right now, Australia, Brazil, the Netherlands, would not jeopardize entire relations because of the death of their citizens," end quote. And you know what? He's right. As much as this might disrupt relations in the short term, it's not going to end them. If China can recover from the Tiananmen Square massacre, Indonesia can recover from this. Plus, as much as Australia, the Netherlands, and Brazil don't like this, it is a sovereignty issue. Indonesia is in the right. It's their laws. It's their rules. We may not like it, but we absolutely do not have a say in the matter. But taking this back to capital punishment, to be honest, I'm conflicted. I don't like the ideas of innocents being executed, which we've seen in several countries around the world, both in ones that we admire and in ones we despise. But I'm also not a fan of life imprisonment. I just don't think it's a just sentence, especially for violent crimes. In my view, prison really isn't about reform. It's about removing a criminal element from society. Why would you allow an individual to return to society 10, 20, 30 years later? Have they truly changed? And then there's the question about how much we as a society pay for that single person behind bars. Spock said in Star Trek, "The good of the many outweighs the needs of the few or the one." So whose need are we serving? The prisoners? Societies? Where is the good? Be sure to let me know your thoughts, because I'd love to know where you stand on this very controversial issue. In addition to this podcast, there is another. It's called Asia Now. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. This week on Asia Now, I spoke with Mark Kozad from the RAND Corporation about what he sees China doing in 2015. And now a quick look at what else is taking place in the region. First up from Japan. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe criticized hate speech this week and vowed that the government will do more to combat and raise awareness against it. Abe said, quote, hate speech diminishes not only the speaker and the target, but also Japan itself." End quote. Laws aren't enough. Public perception must also change. Last month, 20 prefectural and local assemblies asked to make hate speech illegal. But it does raise the question, what is hate speech, and how does defining it not limit free speech? Justice Minister Yoko Kamikawa said, "The government has no plans to introduce new legislation at this time, but only to improve existing laws." Following up on last week's massive cyclones that ravaged Australia, first up in Queensland, which was hit by Cyclone Marcia, it's estimated that 1,500 homes have been destroyed and 100 families remain homeless. Given the surprise severity of that storm, things could have been much worse. About 50,000 homes and businesses were without power after the weekend, and authorities are working to restore that, but it could take up to a week. And generators are being used for traffic lights that are being affected by the power outage. In the Northern Territory, a state of emergency has been declared following Cyclone Lam. In both cases, no serious injuries were reported, but the total repair bill for this disaster could be in the billions of dollars. Hundreds of soldiers and engineers have been dispatched to deal with the massive rain and flooding in the areas and the washing away of roads and bridges. The Seoul District Court has ruled in favor of SK Telecom in a patent lawsuit over messaging application Viber. The court said that Viber infringed on 4 of SK Telecom's patents, forcing the IM application out of Korea. SK Telecom claimed that Viber's feature of reorganizing selected information from contact numbers saved in a smartphone into the application violates the copyright it registered in 2006. This does affect all iOS and Android applications, and no word yet if Viber will appeal. The company didn't specify why Viber was targeted in this lawsuit, and not Daum Kakao or Naver. Industry experts say that this is a move by the telecom to try and push users back to using SMS rather than data messaging. If Viber takes this case to a higher court, SK Telecom said it would consider suing other companies. Former Maldives President Mohammed Nasheed was arrested on anti-terror charges. The charges stem from the arrest of Criminal Court Chief Justice Abdullah Mohammed during his presidency in 2012. Nasheed was taken to court. He said he was pushed and shoved, says that his legs were broken, and he requested to see a doctor. Judge Abdullah Didi gave him 3 days to appoint a lawyer in the case and order that he be held for the duration of the trial. Nasheed was the first democratically elected president, but he stepped down in 2012 in what he calls a coup. India's foreign ministry said that they were concerned at the recent developments in the Maldives, including the arrest and manhandling of the former president, noting that political parties should resolve their differences within the constitutional framework. The United States also expressed concern. Jin Sake said the United States urged the government to take steps to restore confidence in their commitment to democracy, judicial independence, and rule of law, including respect for the rights of peaceful protest and respect for due process. Nasheed's political party has also called upon India to intervene to broker mediation. The measles that popped up in Disneyland appear to be genetically similar to a massive outbreak in the Philippines. The likely source of the United States outbreak was a traveler who visited the park while being contagious. The U.S. CDC doesn't know the exact source, but genetic analysis from 30 different patients show that the measles was of genotype B3, the same type found in the Philippines in 2014 that infected 53,000 and killed 110. So far, there are 141 cases in the United States, 98 from California, and most were unvaccinated. In Myanmar, physicians are dealing with a malaria strain that's resistant to the most effective form of treatment. It swept across Myanmar, approaching the Indian border. Experts were surprised to see the strain in this area, noting that they don't know exactly how it spread so quickly. They're also worried that this strain could migrate to Africa and ruin a current opportunity to wipe out the disease there. Humans get this infectious disease via a mosquito bite. The parasite is then injected into the bloodstream, making its way to the liver, where it multiplies. So far, this resistant strain has been found in Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam, but only in forested areas, not the big cities. With this strain of malaria being resistant to the most effective form of treatment, physicians are worried that options for patient care are diminishing. as we wind down the podcast, I would like to take a special moment to thank everyone who sent in birthday wishes. It truly means a lot, so thank you. Thank you so much. And since we did have a full podcast last week, we did have a few comments, so here are just a couple. First up, when sharing an article about China's influence on Asia's economy, Jay-An wrote in, "Go China." Che Rin Chifa said, "We only want justice and peace. If those want to kill and damage, why are they saying they're Muslim?" This past week, natural disaster struck not only Australia with a pair of cyclones, but an earthquake shook off the northeastern coast of Japan. I truly hope everyone affected by this storm only had minor inconveniences and suffered no catastrophic losses. And I hope that you're all safe and your life returns to normal soon. But Dimitri Pirin let me know via Twitter that where he was, there was only rain, and possibly some flooding, but nowhere near as bad as things were on the coast. And Jonathan Reynolds let me know that he received an emergency text from Japan about the earthquake, but he misread it. He said, "Yeah, I woke up and saw the warning on my phone. I thought it was a high surf advisory. Took me a second to realize that it said tsunami. Only said 1 meter, so we'll see." Again, thank you everyone for those comments. I truly do value them, and I hope you'll take a moment this week to share your thoughts about the stories in the podcast. You can do that in the comments, you can do it on Facebook, or you can do it in Twitter. Now, next week my family's in town, so I'll be taking a little time off, but don't worry, the podcast will still be here, and I have a few special things lined up, so keep a special ear out for them. Keep up with more news from the region by following Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your questions, your comments, and most importantly, your feedback. Just drop a line to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe. You can do that to this and other podcasts on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application, like iTunes or Stitcher. Subscribing is free, and when you do, that next episode is delivered automatically to you. I'll be back on Monday morning with the Asia Brief, so until then, thank you so much for listening. For Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller.